of bees, and it made me wonder, what are fat bees? It made me have all these questions. What are fat bees? What causes a colony to produce fat bees? Can we influence this process? What harms our fat bees, and how can we help them stay healthy and fat? So, fat bees, what are they? And this is there's a website, this is the paper that Dr. Ramsey did about it. He's writing about Varroa destructor, but there is a lot of information in that article about fat bees and exactly what they are and what they do. And if you want to do a little more research, look at scholar.google.com, and that is a great place to find actual scientific evidence. There's a lot of information on the internet that isn't super fantastic, but if you go to scholar.google.com, you'll get more science-based rather than just, you know, the third year wonder. So here's what I've learned so far about fat bees, and every time I do research, I learn a little more. So I'd like to encourage you guys to get out there and do some research about fat bees. It is the intensity of brood rearing that determines the length of life. And what that means is that a fat winter bee has not fed brood. I've got a fly here that's bothering me, so I'm sorry about swatting at it. In the fall, the bees stop making brood when the freeze happens and pollen stops coming in. And those bees that have not fed brood or have not fed brood very much have a completely different physiology than bees that give so much to feeding larval bees. A fat winter bee lives 6 months or longer. They have enlarged hypopharyngeal gland, and the hypopharyngeal gland is the gland in their head, along with their mandibular gland, that produces royal jelly. But that hypopharyngeal gland also has a lot to do with each individual bee's hormone balance, and it changes their whole physiology. So that hypopharyngeal gland is really important. A fat winter bee has less juvenile hormone, and oddly, juvenile hormone is not something that juvenile bees have. It's what makes them stop being juveniles. So young bees that are going to live long have less juvenile hormone, and as they get more juvenile hormone, that is what ages them, and they become older or worker bees. They have enlarged fat bodies, obviously from their name. They're called fat bees because they have more fat bodies. And we humans tend to think of fat cells in ourselves as negative things, but they actually aren't even so negative for us. But in bees, that fat body it functions more like a liver. It's an organ that does a lot in the bee's body. The fat bodies store fat, glucose, protein, triglycerides, and glycogen, and lots of other things. They're a storage unit for that bee. They provide stored energy for heating the colony. So a lot of times in the spring, we look at our colony and we see this nice cluster of bees. They're in contact with honey. We see that there are plenty of them. We don't see any sometimes we don't see issues, like we don't see disease or whatever. We just see this nice cluster of bees and they're all dead. And we wonder, well, why is that? And maybe it's because they did not have stored energy for heating the colony. So that could be impaired fat bodies. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about what damages their fat bodies. So I want to ask you, who will on this screen will be warm this winter? Will it be the fat kittens in the corner, or will it be the skinny kitty? It's going to be the fat one. And because those fat kittens have something to burn off of. I have to tell you, I'm a thin person, and I've purposely gained weight for COVID so that if I got sick, I could survive it. But when I was very thin, I was cold all the time. And this is something that's kind of important for our bees. They need these fat bodies to be able to stay warm. Staying in contact with honey is not enough. They need fat bodies. Okay, there is more that fat bodies do. They are important for pesticide detoxification. And that means that a pesticide that would not normally harm our bees at the levels that it is are deadly for our bees because they don't have the fat bodies to detoxify the pesticides. Fat bodies control the level of vitellogenin, and vitellogenin is a hormone in the bees that produces, it has a lot of effect on the bees. In fact, they're doing research on vitellogenin right now for humans as a potential fountain of youth, because it is vitellogenin that helps keep the bees from aging. And it has a lot to do with their production of royal jelly and just the way their body works. Fat bodies also store 24-methylene cholesterol. And I heard about this the first time a few years ago. It's pretty amazing stuff. Again, we humans tend to think of cholesterol as a bad thing, but cholesterol is really necessary for your body to build the things it needs. This particular one, 24-methylene cholesterol, is found in the food that the bees bring in. So it's in pollen. And there are some sources of 24-methylene cholesterol that are better than others. One of the best sources of 24-methylene cholesterol is borage, which is an herb that the bees love. It blooms late in the summer. It's blue, their favorite color. And here's what 24-methylene cholesterol does for bees. It is critical for their ability to molt. So when a larval bee grows, it sheds its skin sort of like a snake. And if it doesn't have 24-methylene cholesterol, it can't do that. And so it's essentially stuck in its skin and it can't grow and it dies. And 24-methylene cholesterol comes not only from the pollen and the bee bread that the bees store, but the bees store that particular thing in their fat bodies. So then in the spring, when the colony starts making baby bees, the adult bees that are feeding them have that stored, and it comes out in their royal jelly, and it is fed to the baby bees so that they can molt and grow and the colony can grow. So just another wonderful thing that fat bodies do. Fat bodies are also really important for metamorphosis, not outside of the 24-methyl cholesterol. The fat bodies help the larval bee metamorphose from one instar to the next. Fat bodies are important for their immune response, meaning that if a disease comes and threatens them, their body makes more antibodies and things, and it can't do that if it doesn't have proper fat bodies. Without fat bodies, they have an impaired ability to synthesize lipids. And this is kind of interesting. This is what I learned yesterday while I was researching this. When a bee's body synthesizes lipids, that means it makes fat, and wax is a fat, so wax production. If a bee has problems with its fat bodies, it has problems making wax. And here's something else that wax does besides making comb. It waterproofs the bees. And this is really important because a bee needs to be waterproofed to keep from getting dehydrated. And if it doesn't have the ability to waterproof itself, it can dehydrate and die. So it needs good fat bodies to produce lipids to waterproof themselves. It also regulates their metabolism, sort of like your thyroid does for you. It helps them stay warm and things like that. It's just pretty amazing. And all this came out of that article I cited from Sammy Ramsey, most of it. Vitellogenin is one of the things that is really critical in this. It is stored in fat bodies and produced by fat bodies. It is critical in the aging of bees, and the amount of vitellogenin in a bee's body is important in the task shifting that bees do, meaning as they start out as nurse bees, and then as the vitellogenin and juvenile hormone levels change in the bee's body, they shift to more tasks. And then when the vitellogenin level in their body gets low and the juvenile hormone gets high, that is when they become foraging bees. So all this is regulated by fat bodies, and also protein synthesis. And what do we need protein for as a bee? We need that to feed to the baby bees. That is royal jelly. So all this is really critical stuff for our bees. Here's another study that is really interesting. It's Lloyd Harris, if you forget everything else, in Google, Scholar Google, put in Lloyd Harris and read some of the early work he did about winter bees. It's really critical, really exciting. So their lifespan is anywhere from 100 to 200 and even 252 days, really long. And I want to kind of digress for just one second. Have you ever noticed how a laying worker colony, the bees live so much longer without a queen? And have you ever wondered why that is? And that is exactly this same thing. Those bees have not fed larval bees, so they have more fat bodies. And they are, in essence, winter bees, and they can live a lot longer. Not 252 days, because it's summertime. But our winter bees can live all winter long. If you have an old queen, your winter bees will begin to appear in August, at the end of August. And as I said, that's for me here in Colorado, and in Canada, it might be a month later. And the reason for that is because that is when our pollen begins to decrease. And let me define what an old queen is. An old queen is a queen that has been through one spring buildup. So that's not a very old queen. A young queen is a queen that has not been through a spring buildup. So we're talking about a queen that you put in July or August. If you have a young queen, the winter bees will be born later and there will be more of them. Now, it's tempting to think that, oh, if I feed pollen, I can change this. But you actually change it negatively by feeding pollen, because feeding pollen substitute delays the production of winter bees. So don't think that you can feeding pollen in the winter is not such a great idea. So in his article, Lloyd Harris's scientific thing, and this is where we're getting into, can I influence the production of winter bees? He did an experiment where he had these different groups of colonies. Group A had the original package queen. Group B was requeened with a mated queen. Group C requeened with a virgin queen. Group D raised their own, so in essence, an emergency queen. And they did this on July 26th, which is definitely early. You can do it way later. In fact, I'm still putting new queens in now. Here's some of the information from his study. And this is group A in the upper left. You can see that this top slope here is the number of bees that are surviving. And the elbow there where it starts to go down is on April 28th. Okay, that's the old queen. Group B that got a mated queen, they have quite a few more bees that are surviving into April. Group C, kind of similar, and group D that raised their own, most of the bees in the colony are still surviving in April. And the reason for that is because when they raised their own queen, they got a really big brood break, and the summer bees died off. So they didn't have to support they weren't counting a lot of summer bees in that count. The age of the queen also had a lot to do with the cluster size going into winter, which I thought was pretty interesting. Now, all of us in our different microclimates are going to have different needs for cluster size. Here in Colorado, we need about 72 pounds of honey to go into winter, and we cannot run Italian bees because they go into winter with such a huge cluster that we need 140 pounds of honey for Italian bees. So we need to use either Caucasian bees or Carniolan bees, something that goes into winter with a smaller cluster. Excuse me. But you can also influence the cluster size by the age of the queen if you put a new queen in there. So you can see that the cluster size with the old queen is about 17,000 plus or minus a few. The ones that got a mated queen, their cluster size is 20,000 plus 1,000. And then the one that raised their own queen, they have the smallest cluster. And as I said, that is because while they were raising their new queen, the summer bees died off. And now they're only feeding winter bees. So that's something to think about. if you have a problem like we do here in Colorado, that we want to feed the fewest number of bees, but still have enough to stay warm, what are we going to do? We're going to create a brood break in the late summer and then have all those bees in the cluster be winter bees and not bees that are dying off in February after eating half of our honey. These are pretty interesting little ways to visualize what happens to your number of winter bees based on the age of the queen. So you can see that old queen that we started with, she makes a whole bunch of winter bees that emerge on the 12th of September. And then after that, fewer and fewer winter bees. But all the other groups that have new queens raise quite a few more winter bees. In fact, just put in effective requeening in late July and you'll find the article. Okay, so this is the basis of the whole thing. Colonies requeened with newly mated queens or requeened with mature queen cells contained approximately 3,000 more adult bees than colonies allowed to requeen themselves from emergency cells or colonies which retained the original packaged queen. Those are 3,000 more fat bees and fewer summer bees who are just old mouths to feed. All colonies declined in population to about 17,000 bees, which is what bees want. That's about 8 frames of bees. They want to have 8 frames of bees to go into winter with. So the next question we set out to answer is, what would harm our fat bees? And there's the little critter right there, varroa mites. And I'm sorry, but just like everything else in beekeeping, it really comes back to varroa mites. And you see that varroa mite is on the underside of the bee and just slid out from underneath the sections there. That's because that's where varroa mites like to hide. People tell me all the time that I don't need to worry about varroa mites because I don't see any on my bees. And just from talking to your group right now, I realize that you guys don't need to hear this, but I'm going to say it to you anyway because you never know. But the fact that you don't see mites on your bees with your eyes does not mean that they are not there, because the reason the mite is on the underside of that bee and they like to go in between the segments there, sort of in the bee's armpit, because that's where the fat bodies are. And they actually are doing some research on the mite's mouth parts, and they have these like digger mouth parts that dig in and they actually dig a hole in the bee between those segments. And they are kind of mining the fat out of that bee. So you can't see the difference in your bees. They don't actually look more or less fat usually, but they are reducing the bee's ability to survive the winter by removing their fat bodies. So it's really critical that we get the mites under control, and not just at the very end of the season, but we need to get our mites under control when the fat bees are going to be born. Before the eggs even hatch, we need the mites to be under control so that they're not harming our bees. So let's think about how mites reproduce. They reproduce in cells with honeybee larvae. The foundress punctures the larval bee, and that sounds nice. Oh, she punctures the larval bee. What she actually does is digs a hole in the larva. And then her little baby mites, after their eggs hatch, they migrate around the larval bee and they get into that hole and start eating the fat of our larval bee. So it's not just adult bees, but even at the larval stage, the mites are eating the fat bodies of our bees. And that is what's making them sick and not able to stay warm in the winter. And also they inject viruses and bacteria into that hole. And I just read yesterday that when the mite does this, it actually leaves saliva in there too, which is, even once the mite is gone, it's damaging the bee because there's this saliva in there. It's just nasty stuff. When the bee emerges, 3 to 5 mature mites emerge with the bee, particularly if they're drones. And have you all ever noticed, and maybe it's just me, but right now I'm going through my colonies and I use a lot of foundation-less frames, which means the bees can use a lot more drones wherever they want, and they're still raising drones. And you have to ask yourself, Why are they raising drones right now when they're not planning to make any queens? They're good, strong colonies, and they're raising all these drones. And it's my theory, and haven't read this anywhere else, that the reason they're raising drones is to give the mites somewhere to be besides on the worker bees. And so this is about the only, because I raise queens too, this is about the only time of year I do drone culling, because I need the drones the rest of the year to mate with my queens. But right now, I think that the bees are raising those drones for there to be somewhere for the mites to be. And so I'm gonna help them by, and since the mites are, the drones are like all over my comb because they raise their own, I just use my uncapping scratcher. And if they're purple-eyed, you can actually poke the uncapping scratcher through all the drones' heads and pull them out, which I know sounds horrible. But when you do that, you actually pull out the mite too, and you can kind of see how many mites there are and what your infestation level is. But even if you just puncture the cappings over the cells, then the mites that are in there can't reproduce. So I'm helping my colonies by killing the drones that they're making right now, because I think that's why they're doing it. Okay, so now we've established that the mites are damaging our larval bees. And of course, we know that they are feeding on our adult bees as well. And they're in between those segments in their kind of armpits. And so no fat cells means no vitellogenin, no protein, and no longevity. So, and all of this influences not only the bees that we have now, but the bees that will begin to be born during the winter. So it's just really important to get all of this under control. Okay, so I said I don't see mites on my bees. So how am I going to find out if I have mites on my bees? And that's by monitoring. Michelle was telling us that she's counted the mites in all of her colonies, 30 colonies, and that's awesome. You're counting all those, that's a lot of work. But I used to put off monitoring for mites because I thought it was so much work and so time consuming. It literally takes about 3 minutes per colony, and it's not a big deal. So you can do a powdered sugar roll or alcohol wash. I've done a comparison and I don't really see much difference. If I do a powdered sugar roll, then put the bees in alcohol, I don't see more mites come out. So it tells me that the way I'm doing it is working for me. You need a ½ cup of bees, 2 tablespoons of powdered sugar or alcohol to cover. I put them in the sun if I'm not using my smoker. Somebody asked recently, why is it that when they're doing a mite count, the bees get all sweaty and the powdered sugar gets wet and then it doesn't seem to work right? And that's because they've used their smoker, so the bees have ingested honey. And then when they, if you put them in a jar in the sun, they get hot. And when bees get hot, they vomit that honey back out. It coats them and it gets them all wet. And then the powdered sugar is just wet on them and it doesn't work as well. So if I use my smoker, I put my little jar of 300 bees in the shade. If I don't use my smoker, which is usual, I put it in the sun, and that helps desiccate the mites and they fall off. After 2 minutes of just sitting in the jar, and I'm kind of rotating the jar to make sure the powdered sugar is on everything, then I shake it. I wrote this when I was actually doing 90 seconds. Now I'm just doing like a minute. If I don't see any more bees after 45 seconds, sometimes I'll quit then. But try to be consistent so that you know that you're doing a great job. Then you spray your plate with water and all those mites show right up and you can count them. Excuse me. How many is too many? Right at this time of year, that is 2% or 6 mites per 300 bees. Look at that evil creature on our bee. I mean, it's nasty. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? And why are we doing this again? We're doing it so that our bees will have good fat bodies and be healthy. It's really important. So we're going to do it before the fat bees are even eggs. And I use organic treatments. That means Midway quick strips. It's very difficult to do that here in the high desert because it's too hot until it's too late. So, I'm sorry. You can watch the weather. It's the first 3 days that are super critical, that you need it to stay below 85 degrees. Thymol or Apigard is the same. The directions there says 105, but at that kind of temperature, you're going to see a lot of brood damage. So it really, if you can do it below 85 degrees, that's fantastic. A nice rainy weather when it's going to be a little bit cooler would be fantastic. I can't necessarily suggest that you use the oxalic acid shop towels because that's not legal yet. However, just hypothetically, if I had been trying that, I think they would be working great. I do a lot of top bar hives and horizontal hives, and they're a little bit harder to treat because treatments are meant for Langstroth hives that have a lot of ventilation and they have, tops that are open and stuff. And so another thing for you North Carolina people, though, is those shop towels aren't going to work very well for you where it's a lot more humid. I checked your humidity was like 68%, or was it 86% today? It was very humid there today. My humidity here is 17%, and we think that's sticky at 17%. So the shop towels do not work where it's humid. Hop Guard is another organic treatment. It's made with hops, same thing your beer is made with. That one doesn't have a temperature rating, but it does not also not have as high a mite drop as the others. It will help control it, but it's not super great. They keep trying. We've got Hop Guard 3 now, but I hear it's not any better. So here our treatment should be applied by August 17th. And that's because our fat winter bees are going to start being born the following week. For you there, where your first freeze is not going to be until October, you probably have another month. But you all know better than I do, obviously, when your pollen's going to stop coming in. What if they already have a disease? And where did they get diseases? They get those from mites, partly, and partly from drifting. For all diseases except American foul brood, the cure is the same. And I'm not recommending the use of antibiotics for European foul brood or Nosema, because the jury is out as to how good those are. And it looks like if you have a European foul brood and use an antibiotic to get that back under control, it's going to look like you conquered the European foul brood and you're going to feel great. And then quite often in the spring, you'll find that colony dead and you can't quite figure out why. And that's because the antibiotic knocked out the gut biome of the bee, and although you conquered the European foul brood, then they got another opportunistic pathogen and it took them out anyway. So it's better to not use that if you don't have to. And so where is the most brood diseases are in the brood. So a brood break allows the bees to clean out the diseased larva or pupa, and it allows everything to just stop being diseased. Most of them need more ventilation, and I would think that where it's humid, more ventilation is even better. So open the bottom of your screen bottom, put popsicle sticks under your inner covers, and increase that ventilation quite a bit. And also, a great flow is one of the best things to stop a disease. So I was talking to Lee, who said that she hasn't had a very great flow this year because it's been raining constantly. And here we have we have often a drought or a dearth because it never rains. So here we have problems with rain. If you're going to feed sugar water to your bees to simulate a flow, it's, I think, important to adjust that sugar water to 4.5. There are some interesting scientific studies out there, again on scholar.google.com, that say that adjusting the sugar water to a 4.5 or less, it increases the likelihood of the bee's survival by 30%. And the reason is because honey and nectar have a pH of 4.5. And sugar water has a pH of 7 or so. And our bees are they're built to be healthy at that 4.5 kind of acidic. And bee diseases are really thrive at a pH of more like 7. So what do we want to be healthy, our bees or our bee diseases? And it's obvious. So you adjust that sugar water with ascorbic acid. You can also use apple cider vinegar, and the bees love the apple cider vinegar, and it gives the water a little flavor so they can communicate about it. But there are no studies that I'm aware of that say that adjusting the pH with vinegar helps them. But there are studies that say adjusting it with ascorbic acid, which is a vitamin C powder that you can get at natural grocers. And so you'll need to get pH strips too, and just make that adjustment. And you can requeen. I'm requeening some of my colonies right now. And any of my girls that have a spotty pattern, or now because I'm breeding bees, it's really important to me to keep my genetic lines going. So I'm probably a little more likely to keep older queens because I don't want to lose that line. But what I might do is pull my old queen out into a nuke and then give the bigger colony a new queen. So I still have that old queen and I will overwinter her as a nuke. And then I'll have a new queen in my big colony. And then the nice thing about that is that not only does that new queen going into winter in your bigger colony produce more fat bees and more winter bees, but in the spring, she is so ready to go. And they get started so quickly in the spring. It's really exciting. So young queens are fantastic. And then remove black or disease-containing comb. And this is something also a little bit off topic, but while I'm talking about removing black or disease-containing comb, I want to point out that that's something that's kind of important to do right now. And this is a fall management thing. So when I'm going through my colonies, if I'm doing a frame-by-frame inspection, which I don't always do, to see like how good my brood pattern is or whatever, the brood frames that are getting dark, I move to the outside if I'm in my Langstroth colonies, or where the brood chamber isn't going to be. And then in the spring, early spring, that young queen is going to start right in the middle of the colony, and she's going to put her brood right in the center. And so now I've moved newer comb that looks nicer to the center. And when I get in there in the spring, those black ones that I moved to the outside won't have anything in them, and I can pull them very easily. If you leave those black ones in the middle and they get brood in them in the spring, then you don't want to pull them because they got brood in them. So move them to the side right now. That way you can get them out in the spring. If they have disease in them right now though, it's hard to throw away brood, but do it. Just bite the bullet and get rid of that comb that has European foul brood in it. Or if you had a terrible amount of chalk brood this year, get rid of that. Fall feeding is important for our fat bees, because as we all know, larval bees that are well fed right from when the egg hatches are healthier bees. And so pollen substitute does not help in the production of fat winter bees. It prolongs the production of normal bees. But if you don't have pollen coming in, that is something that might be important, is to give them pollen substitute. Pollen substitute supposedly is largely indigestible. So if you can have some of your own pollen to mix in with that, it will make the pollen substitute more digestible for them. And there's also I've just seen some new studies on using pollen that has blue-green algae in it. And that is supposed to be really amazing. I've been using it on my queen rearing colonies and the bees love it too. So if you must use a pollen substitute, I think that one would be a good one to try. It's not a good idea to put pollen substitute in the fall and not to have it in there in the winter, because bees just don't need that. They need kind of what should normally be there. Bees need 2.2 pounds of honey per week of winter. And when I say winter, I mean from when pollen stops coming in until it starts coming in again. So for me, that is from first freeze to last freeze, and that's equals 72 pounds of honey. It might be a lot less for you. It looks like it's quite a bit warmer there in North Carolina. And then we talked about, now in the fall, we're going to feed thicker sugar water, 2 to 1, 2 parts of sugar to 1 part of water. And that's because it's already almost honey. It's so thick. You don't want a lot of extra humidity in your colony by feeding them 1 to 1. So start feeding 2 to 1. And then we're going to help our bees by also doing regular winter preparation. Recheck for mites. If you had to treat for mites, don't just assume that that treatment worked, because they don't always work. Things happen, the weather changes, whatever. So the best time is 10 days to 2 weeks after you treated to count, do a real count for mites again and make sure that worked. And then we put our screen bottom board covers in. And then this is when I don't remove propolis. Ron and I were talking about how awesome propolis is for bees. But if there's like a ton of propolis on the ends of the frames, I like to take that and rub it on the entrance so that they have to walk over it as they come and go, and on inside the walls. But in general, I don't remove propolis in the winter. They've been putting it there and I let them keep it. And they're going to have propolis seals between their hive bodies if you're running Langstroth colonies. And we want to not break those propolis seals when it starts to be cool enough that it would be hard for them to repair those. Put your mouse guards on, because when bees are clustered, they can't defend themselves against mice. And there is nothing grosser than getting in your colony in the spring and finding propolized mice in there. I mean, I know the bees took care of it, but and I've never seen a mouse kill a colony, but they do eat our wax and our honey, and they just remove some of the things that our bees need. Here where it gets cold, we put tar paper on our colonies on the outside at Thanksgiving, not insulation, because insulation keeps the colony cold. We want the sun to warm that and keep it a little bit warmer. It also helps keep the wind out. We have some places here have quite a bit of wind. And then add ventilation, or think about your ventilation is maybe a better way to say it. For you where it's really humid, ventilation can be a major issue, but it also reduces some of the heat. One great thing to do is put insulation under your outer cover, and that keeps the moisture from rising off the bees and condensing above them where it can drip back down. If you have insulation there, that means that the walls will be colder, and so the moisture from the bees will go to the walls, where the bees can actually go to pick up that moisture and use it for water in the winter if they need to. Because surprisingly, bees don't eat straight honey. They need to dilute that with water. Okay, so back to the questions we started with. What are fat bees? They are bees that have not fed larval bees, and thus they have more fat bodies. What causes a colony to produce fat bees? Reduced incoming pollen and the age of the queen influences when and how many of those fat bees are produced. Can we influence this process? Yes, by fall requeening. What harms our fat bees? Obviously, mites and diseases. And how can we help them stay healthy and fat? Control mites early and ensure well-fed bees right from when the egg hatches. So that is the entirety of my talk. I would love to open it up for questions to you now. So please feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question, or Susan and Debbie are going to help with whatever might be in the chat.
Well, that was amazing. Thanks, Tina. I wrote down so many things. This has been for me the summer of myth busting. And so there were a couple of things that you said, and I was trying to scribble them down as fast as I could, that just busted a few myths. And so that was great. And I think it's always important to stay open-minded about, you know, what happens in the hives and what we think are the case. And So my philosophy is if a beekeeper starts by saying, this always happens, then usually I quit listening.
Exactly. That's one of the ways I say that you can tell if you're getting good advice. If the advice you get comes with a caveat, this happens when, or you should do this if, and usually is like the key word in beekeeping, because there's never an always, unfortunately. So, and the other thing about that, Susan, what you said, myth busting, a lot of the things we think we know, we don't really know. Just like, was it 4 years ago, we discovered that mites aren't feeding on hemolymph. We thought we knew that and we didn't. So who knows how many of the things I said tonight that came from scientific research, we don't actually know, but it's a good place to start.
So Libby has asked the question, if you would repeat what you said about what type of pollen substitute your bees like.
It's a pollen substitute that has blue-green algae in it. And it's been, there was a research paper, I think it was in Bee Culture a month or two ago, maybe June, so there was actual research about that blue-green algae. And there's some online too. And I got it from Healthy Bees LLC. And it wasn't even that expensive. And one thing that I really appreciate is that the bees loved it, which they don't always like pollen substitute. Another great thing you can do with pollen substitute, though, is to mix your own pollen into it, and that really helps it be more digestible for them.
Now, you mentioned that feeding pollen in the middle of the winter might not be the right thing to do because it could slow down the buildup of fat bees. And I'm assuming from that you meant like sticking pollen patties inside your hives for winter, as opposed to.
If you buy,
go ahead.
Exactly. If you buy what's called a winter patty, it has way less pollen in it, or pollen substitute, than summer patties do, and this is something that commercial guys do a lot. It's warmer for them, and so they put pollen patties on, and the bees keep making bees, so they don't get a brood break through the winter. So unless your bees really have no bee bread in their colony, it's probably better not to use pollen substitute in the fall and winter, because it can trick them into doing something that they don't need to do. And really, all the time when you're feeding bees, it's best to let them, if we can, let them do what nature is providing for them. If it's time for pollen to be coming in, then that's when they should be getting pollen. And if it's not time, then they probably shouldn't be getting pollen. But if it is time for pollen to be coming in and the weather is a problem, then that's a reason to probably add to them. But in the fall is probably not the best time. And it's also tricky for new beekeepers to use pollen substitute in the spring, because the bees are wanting to start making babies in the spring. And if you put a pollen patty in there, it makes them raise a lot more brood. And if you don't have a flow that's going to come right away, that they can actually starve themselves pretty easily by making a lot more brood than they have honey stored for if there's no nectar coming in. So see what I mean about tricking the bees into doing something that they shouldn't be doing.
Well, that's an interesting.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And that's an interesting point, which I should probably let Lee speak to, because she probably speaks to it more eloquently than I do. But one of the problems that we have here in our climate is that we get these really bizarre winters where we'll have, it'll be super cold, sub-freezing weather, maybe some sleet, snow, ice. And then like the next week or even a few days later, it'll be 70. And it'll just bounce back and forth throughout the winter. And it gets worse as we move into, like late February. And one of the things that we notice, or at least I've noticed in my own apiary, is that I'm most likely to see losses if we get one of those wild swings. And I wondered if it has to do with this buildup and then suddenly this cold snap, which requires them to have to huddle down. and the ratio, if you will, of bees available to cover the brood they've got and feed them is off.
Boy, I bet your intuition is really pretty much all right on it. Yeah. And Lee, don't be afraid to jump in here. You are way more eloquent than I am, and you live there. So jump in and put your 2 cents in there, all of you. You know, we have a small group. We can have a nice conversation here.
I was just thinking when you were talking about it's always this way except when it's not. I mean, that to me, when I'm teaching new beekeepers, is, in fact, I found myself texting a person I'm mentoring saying, it's usually almost always this way except when it's not. And that is so much. And there's so many things I'm puzzled on. Like you mentioned the insulation thing. And I've read all the stuff about the insulation. It should not help. Yet in my smaller hives, it works beautifully. And you know, I mean, I definitely agree on the top insulation for sure. I think that's a good thing, but it's just amazing how many things we don't actually know, but have to try out. And
right, exactly. I know a lot of people that overwinter nukes use insulation on their north sides to keep that north side warmer, and then let the south side that's going to have the sun, let that absorb that heat. So yes, exactly. We're going to learn what works for us. And that's one of the neat things about, oh, my mind just went blank. The people who do the surveys. Who is that, Lee? That is, you know.
Are you talking about the census?
No.
Be informed.
Be informed. Why could I not think of that?
Oh, yeah.
Right, because they can actually break it out by your state. So they can say, did you insulate in North Carolina? And if you did, what was your survival rate? Or did you use tar paper? Or did you use screen bottoms? Whatever. It's not, sometimes their conclusions I don't really agree with, because they're like separating things out, but you can learn a lot from that. So take it with a grain of salt and use your own mind. But there's some good information on there. Be informed. And if you can, send in your information to them, and because it really helps them learn. In fact, yes, somebody wrote that, be informed. Our bee club actually has forms that our people fill out, especially for mite control, which is great because this is how we're learning what works here. So like I said, one of the guys used that hop guard, and he sent in his mite control form and said, this is how many mites I had before I used it. This is how many mites I had after I used it. So now I'm going to use something else. And in that way, we can learn what works for us.
I thought it was interesting that you mentioned and I'm so glad you've done this, because this is an experiment I actually wanted to do myself, is do the powder roll, sugar roll, and then take the bees out of that after you've shaken out, you know, the sugar and the mites, and dump them into alcohol and see how many more there are. I have to admit, I don't do alcohol because I just can't get over the idea of killing 300 bees. I hate it when I squish one with the inner cover. But at the same time, I've been wondering, like, how many more mites are you going to get? And so I've been sort of in my mind doing the little mental calculation. If I see 2 mites in 300, I'll just assume I really have 3 or 4, and then I'll make a decision about whether I want to treat. And obviously, when you get really high numbers, like Michelle was talking about earlier, then it's clear what you need to do. But it's in those low numbers. And I actually tested a hive on Sunday, and I got 0. And I looked at it, and I went through it again, and I had somebody else look at it. And then I realized, wait, this was a late summer queen that I got from Michelle. So basically, she hasn't had time to build up enough brood for them to get mites. And so it really wasn't that big a surprise afterwards. But yeah, I mean, everyone has mites, and it's just a question of how many. But knowing that your powder sugar roll and the the alcohol gave you basically the same answer. That's good to know. That's sort of vindicating that, okay, if I don't have to kill my bees if I don't want to.
Right, exactly. And Randy Oliver's been doing a lot of work on this lately too. So you can read his website, scientificbeekeeping.com. And he's been doing, of course, he loves the alcohol wash and he really pushes that. But he says you'll only get 1 or 2 more, exactly what you're saying you calculate, Susan. So, yeah. And have you read what else he's working on lately about where to get your sample from?
Well, no, I guess I haven't. I have to say, because I get so crazy busy in the summer, I'm already 7 months behind in reading American Beekeeping. So that'll, I'm waiting for, you would think that I've had plenty of rainy days. I should be caught up by now, but I haven't. So where is he saying not to sample on the brood anymore? Open brood?
He's saying that you don't have to sample on open brood. He's saying that the frame next to the brood is almost as good. It's also going to be 1 or 2 mites lower than over open brood, but you add those 1 or 2 in, and that gives you a better chance to not catch the queen in it. And it really makes sense, because if our nurse bees are feeding larval bees, they need to be going to that bee bread quite often. And so it sounds like, if I remember correctly, he actually killed some colonies to see how many mites were on this frame and how many mites on this frame and how many mites on this frame. So he could really compare the number of mites per frame and what was on it. So kind of exciting.
It is exciting, but leave it to Randy to kill an entire colony just to count bees.
I know. That's why we need him, because I could never do that. I'm like, you can't kill my 300.
Yeah. Well, does anybody else have any questions or any comments for Tina? I've been so excited. And I realized after you got started talking that I didn't even actually introduce you, though. Debbie did a wonderful job of introducing you in our mail out for tonight's meeting.
Yeah, I saw that.
So, but who's left on the call here? Let me do a quick look.
I just wanted to say thank you. Everything you've been saying tonight has been kind of like with Lee with her podcast, right on par with what I've been doing, and like the little things I've been wondering about, like the shiny bees when I was doing the sugar roll, and about smoker and not smoker. I mean, I wasn't wondering about that, but that was really interesting because I did see shiny bees. But everything you said tonight, I hope this was recorded so I could watch it again and share it with people, because it was just fascinating, all these things I've been doing lately, and you really honed in and answered a lot of questions. So I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate it. Very helpful.
Awesome.
Thumbs up.
Thanks, Michelle. We all like to be vindicated in what we're doing, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I feel like you're like my sister from another mister, but like with more experience. Like, I really appreciate all your insight and experience and sharing it with us, because it's cool. Yeah.
You're too nice.
No, I appreciate it.
We mentioned earlier what a trophy it is to have Michelle as part of our chapter, especially with all she's done in the last year with queen rearing and such. But the other trophy we have, as you well know, is Lee, because Lee does the podcast, and she has brought in some really incredible interviews for making access for people that might not normally get them. And I will say that I actually am caught up on the podcast, so so that's pretty exciting. And it's I just feel like our chapter we're a pretty good sized chapter for as small a community as we live in. We cover 3 counties, but that 3 counties has a total population of maybe 30,000 people in all 3 counties. So, but we have like 50 or 60 active members that are, well, I say active, they're certainly paying members. They attend meetings on a regular basis or participate in events and such. So beekeeping in Western North Carolina is an old-timey thing. It goes back, and it's part of the Appalachian survival process. And it's been nice to see younger people. When I say younger, Michelle is young. Debbie, Lee, and I are not so young. We're moving to long highs. But it's really nice to see a lot of younger people getting involved and people who are willing to just experiment and try things. I mean, Michelle really stepped out on a limb this year and she didn't just jump in the deep end of the pool with both feet. She jumped in with carrying a 100-pound weight and still came up. So it's been great. I think a lot of it, I have to agree with her, has to do with the interactions we've had through Lee with people like yourself and Brian Fisher, Sam Comfort. So I feel like we're on a whole new level than we were 4 or 5 years ago. And it's nice to be able to have these interactions. So I thank you very much for taking the time to go through this and talk with us. And we will have you and your husband in North Carolina before the end of next year, if everything works out.
I'm so excited to hear that. I was really hoping this wouldn't be my only chance to talk to you, and I really want to see your part of the country. And now that I've heard from you, I'm thinking we're looking to move somewhere. Maybe it would be.
It's funny because Sam just got a property around here too.
Yeah.
Everybody wants to come here.
It's true.
Sam Comfort did?
Yeah. He's thinking of doing like a bee school around here because he goes from New York to Florida, so it's kind of in the middle. And we're just, we're really cool around here.
Well, obviously.
I'm just kidding, but yeah, he's doing research too. He's doing like a few SARE grants this year. So he's going to take a little break.
Yeah, I got to talk to him at Apamondia. He was a lot of fun to talk to.
Yeah, he is. I don't want to keep going, but we could talk forever about Sam.
That's right.
I did a little presentation. I'll post it eventually about my time with him in Florida. So when I post it, I'll share it with you. Okay.
I'd appreciate that. That would be
Yeah.
Yeah, it seemed like
Tina,
he had a
this is Debbie. So thank you so much for this presentation. It was great. I really appreciate you doing this, and I hope we can have you come down here in person sometime.
Thanks. I appreciate that. This one is a new talk, and they get better as I get to do them more. So I have some other good talks I think you guys will like and that I've gotten to practice on more.
Well, that's great. That's really great. Okay, well, we'll let you go because it's about dinner time for you, and well, it's getting close to bedtime for me. Thank you again, and we'll certainly keep in touch with you. And I'm sure if I don't talk to you before then, have a good fall, and I hope things even out for everybody in Colorado, and that you have fat bees going in the winter.
Sounds good. I wish you fat bees as well. Thanks for having me. You guys are a great group.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
All right. We'll see you soon.